Welcome to the Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. My name is Dr. Adriana Popescu. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and leader in the field of mental health, energy psychology, addiction, trauma, and empowerment. In this podcast, we will be exploring mental health from a variety of perspectives, from the spiritual to the shamanic and beyond. What if mental illness isn't everything we think it is? What if everything we see as a pathology is actually a possibility? What else is possible with mental health?
Hi everyone, Dr. Adriana Popescu with you today with a very special episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This is our 100th episode, and I wanted it to be something special, and I couldn't think of anyone else I'd rather have with me on this podcast celebration than my good friend and colleague, TJ Woodward. He is a visionary. He is a thought leader. I have known TJ for years. We worked together in rehab programs, and we collaborated on his wonderful workbooks to accompany his 3 books he's written: Conscious Creation, Conscious Recovery, and Conscious Being. We've written co-written 4 workbooks together. And it's such a joy to have you here today, TJ. Welcome.
Thank you, Adriana, and congratulations on 100. I was reflecting on, I used to have a TV show in San Francisco, as you know, because you were a guest many times. And my big goal was to get to 100. I made it to 86 episodes, and then I wasn't able to keep it going. So I know what it takes to hit that 100 mark. So congratulations.
Yes, thank you. And you were on one of the very first episodes. You were on a couple times, you and then one time with Jeremy. And we've done a lot of collaborative things together. And the reason I think in part I wanted you here today is because, we met in the beginning of the pandemic back in whenever it was, 2019, 2020, a few years ago now. And you and I got together with some other folks and spoke about the intensity and the craziness of that time. And there was a lot of fear and nobody knew what was going on. And we said we created a talk, something like staying insane in insane times. Well, it's only gotten more insane post-pandemic. It hasn't really gotten a lot better. In fact, it's gotten a lot worse. And so I wanted to talk about kind of the state of affairs in the world today, and how those of us who are seeking more, who are trying to maybe bring some light into the world, those of us who are aware that a different possibility is available, I really wanted to offer today a message of hope for those who might still be struggling and experiencing a lot of darkness. I think the whole planet is in a dark night of the soul right now. So I think you're the best person I could think of to have this conversation with. So let's maybe just start with, where we were 4 years ago and where we are now. And let's just acknowledge the truth of like what is happening in the world that's really having people in a really rough place.
Yeah, thank you. And I love the conversation because staying sane in an insane world is something that I know that we have to choose on a moment-to-moment basis. What is sanity? What is insanity? We can unpack that. But to me, sane is staying anchored in a greater reality, as you mentioned, staying anchored in the truth of our being that is this place within us that is unharmed and unharmable, and realizing that when I believe I am my opinions, I'm going to be in conflict with the world, right? And right now we see this very pronounced. I don't know if it's different than it's really ever been in the world. I think the main thing that's different is the access to these little computers in our hands that I have mine upside down for the show. But, we could say we're addicted to it, but the information is coming just with rapid speed. And also, what we know is that we can edit and clip, and now we have AI. Like, we don't even know if what we're seeing is actually something that happened. So we're living in this very interesting time. And when we were in the midst of COVID, we saw a pronouncement or an acceleration of the idea of division, right? And the way I'll say it is this: we have been told, let's take the US. I know you have an international audience, but for the US, we have been told that we are in a polarized country. I actually think that it's more that we have been conditioned to have polarized thinking. So what I mean by that is we've been conditioned to look at the world through the lens of good and bad and right and wrong, and that I am my opinions. So if someone disagrees with me, I automatically other them. There's a judgment, and boy, did we see that pronounced during COVID. And I think a lot of times people will say, "Oh, it's so great, it's over now." Well, what you and I know about traumatic events, which it was a global traumatic event, really we don't start to experience the effect of that until after it's pretty much finished. Then it's like we all take a breath, and then we start to see, the suicide rates, the addiction rates, more of this divisiveness. So we're in an interesting time, and I'm excited to be in a conversation of offering some really practical ways we don't have to be in the midst of that.
Yes. So many things that you said jump out at me, but the one that really pangs is this idea that we are conditioned, we are taught to be polarized. And I think this is a time, I don't remember it being this way when I was a kid growing up, where there was so much open, hostile, um, there used to be intelligent discourse, like, oh, you have a different view on that, let's talk about it. Let me try to understand where you're coming from, you try to understand where I'm coming from. And now it's just anger. There's so much emotion that comes with that polarized thinking of we're right and you're wrong, or the other way around. How did that happen? I mean, how is it that you think that, like it got so intense and so accelerated?
Well, I think it's always been a part of human nature. And I'll say what I mean by that. Whether we call it tribalism, finding our tribe of people, a group of people, we hear the term like minded people. And the implication of that is, let me find a group of people who agree with me. And if I can find a group of people who agree with me, then I'll be what? Safe, I'll be seen, I'll be loved. And so the issue with that, of course, is when we're in that mindset, what if I actually have a different point of view than my quote unquote tribe? Either I'm going to bury that or pretend like it's not true, or I'm going to somehow change my thinking to agree with what this group is saying. So it's kind of always been here. And I 100% agree with you. I think about, I'm older than you are. And, when I would watch the news, it seemed more impartial. Now news stations are really not even trying to be unbiased. There's clearly, whether you watch CNN or Fox, they're actually giving you two different versions of the same story. So that's a big part of it. And of course, social media is a big part of it, right? It absolutely is. So what do we do in the midst of that? That's the conversation today. But what I think the way it got created is really safety. When we were earlier in the evolution of human consciousness, or the development of the human, if you will, we did have to have tribes to stay alive. Did animals were going to eat us, other tribes were going to kill us. And even though that's happening on some level in the world, we have this story that the world is worse than it's ever been, but that's actually not true. People are living longer, there's less hunger, there's less war. It still exists, but we are in some ways evolving, but we also in some ways are not.
So the thing I get there is the external focus, right? Like I need, and yes, humans. Dr. Gabor Mate talks about this all the time. About like how addiction, for example, is really a social disease. It's about lack of connection, and as human beings, we need that. We need to have connection to other humans. But in the beginning, you're right. It was more about survival. I think our country, our world right now is very much in survival mode, and everyone is looking externally. I think we are taught, especially as children, to look to the external for answers. We look to the authority figures, our teachers, our leaders, and if government or religious leaders. We look to religion, certain philosophies and belief systems, to show us what is real and true, rather than looking internally. And I wonder if that's a piece of what's happening on the planet right now, is that we are being called as humanity to maybe stop looking outward for the answers and start asking some questions and looking within. Can you comment on that?
100%. And in both my books, actually, they're both right here, but Conscious Being and Conscious Creation, I have a framework where I talk about the different levels of human consciousness. And at what I call the martyr level, which is also like the victim level, which most of the planet is still in, and throughout history most of the world has been stuck in that. And that's this idea that I'm a victim to the world, that I must protect myself. There's a deep entrenchment in us and them and good and bad and right and wrong. And so in that, we're in survival. And right. So we could also call it the animalistic level of consciousness. I know that you like to talk about it through the brain, and we can dive into that. The bottom line is, yes, we are animals, and yet we're much more than that. So that consciousness, that fear consciousness of us and them, right and wrong and good and bad, that's where about 80% or 85% of the planet still lives. But there are more and more of us who are evolving, right? What once used to be for the mystics and the sages is now something that we are understanding each of us has access to, right? And the reason I'm kind of diving into that is at that, what we would call lower level of consciousness. And it's not that it's bad or wrong. It's just, it creates war, it creates conflict. And do we want to continue that, or are we ready to evolve? And as more of us wake up to this different possibility, consciousness on the planet starts to shift. And sometimes it looks like a mess, if you will. I had my life completely fall apart when I was around 40 years old. And that was an entry point into a new way of being. So that's, I think, what's happening globally right now. We're wanting to move into a new level.
Well, there's this archetypal, I love archetypal imagery and concepts. Here I am wearing my Phoenix bird shirt today. And if you look at that, concept, the myth of the Phoenix bird, it's that, there was complete ruin, like complete collapse, everything has to fall apart. And from the ashes, this beautiful firebird, rises, and it's very powerful and potent, and it is, a beautiful evolution into a higher level of consciousness. And I get that. Yeah, I think that is happening on the planet right now. Things are needing to collapse. There are systems that have been, thousands of years old that aren't really working anymore. The suppression of women, for example, in certain parts of the world, or even there's a movement in America for that, for women to be put back into a less equal place, a lesser than place. Um, it's almost as if all these systems, economic, political, financial, they kind of have to, educational, they kind of have to fall apart so something new can get created. But I think in the middle of that, people are so afraid. There's so much fear on the planet right now that it's almost casting this like shadow of darkness. I don't know. Can you speak to that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you're saying is absolutely true. And we're in the midst of this profound transformation. And the key in the midst of that to me is to recognize, and you said it earlier, to question, to be curious about my thoughts, to be curious about my points of view, because it's really not a left or right thing. If you're talking about politics, it's this deep entrenchment in dogmatic ideology, right? I know I'm right. And I see this on both quote unquote sides, right? And then when we're in the midst of that, then we're stuck, right? And as you said, we're trying to then grab onto what's known. But what we want to do is start to ask ourselves what else is possible, not what have we known. And one of the things that's important to bring into the conversation to me is, it's yes, when things fall apart, we have an opportunity for this new growth. But I actually think, and what I think you and I are both saying is, we actually have the shift in consciousness first. And as we have that shift in consciousness, then things start to fall apart. That's the opportunity for this new growth that can happen, and ushering in a new era. And we've been talking about it, for the last 40 years or something, whether we call it the age of Aquarius or the dawn of the new age. And it is at this moment, I'm responsible. Each of us is responsible to ask ourselves, how am I going to contribute? Am I going to contribute to the fear and the divisiveness because that's that reactive impulse of the ego? Or am I going to bring a different energy into the conversation, different energy into all of my relationships? Because what happens individually always happens globally. And what happens globally is also happening individually.
Right, exactly. The almost like the idea of a holographic universe, where like, it goes, what is at the very most cellular level gets like put out, mirrored into the world, and vice versa. Like that's the nature of things. So I think what we're talking about, and I want to just kind of name it, because if spirituality is not something, a lot of people fully understand. I think a lot of people have confused religion and spirituality. You talk about this a lot in your writing. And so when we're talking about this idea of the dark night of the soul, which I think you're referencing that you went through when you were 40, I certainly went through it when I was really, really sick with my Lyme disease and chronic fatigue syndrome. And it felt like, my whole life was falling apart. It needed to do that. That was part of my spiritual awakening and my spiritual growth and emergence. And I think sometimes people, and you see this a lot with like AA and the pink cloud idea, or like spiritual bypass. I think people think that, oh, well, when I get more spiritual, it's all going to be positive and wonderful, and I'm going to be like love and light, and that's not necessarily at all how the process goes.
That's right. Yeah, because it's that seeking that bliss or that love or that light that actually can get in the way of an actual spiritual experience. And so what do we mean by that? If it's true, and in my experience it is, that we come into the world as a whole and perfect and infinite spiritual being, and then we get programmed by the world to believe we're damaged or limited. And once we believe we're damaged or limited, then, as you said earlier, which was so perfect, is then we start to look outward, outside of ourselves, to try to feel whole again. And that's why we have these relationships that can be really frustrating. If I believe I'm broken, unconsciously I'm choosing a broken person, and then I'm like, this person is toxic, so I need to get rid of them, and then I find myself in the same relationship. Right? So what we're talking about with a deeper sense of spirituality, especially as we're moving through these levels that I talk about, when we move into this level that I call mystical, which is we're all one, anything other than that is going to show up for us to clear, to cleanse, right? It's not a quote unquote bad thing as things fall apart. It can be a really wonderful thing. Doesn't mean it's not painful. I think a lot of times people want to bypass that, like you said, and like, oh, everything's great. Everything's love and light. I'm so spiritual, so I don't have emotions. And actually, a deeper spirituality is moving into the emotions, moving into the body, really physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual.
Yes. And for whatever reason, this came into my head, the whole psychedelic resurgence, and how people are using psychedelics often with the intention of having these more profound spiritual openings, heart openings, um, connecting with some really beautiful things, but also you don't know when you ingest that substance if it's going to go to that, or it's going to go to some real dark, maybe unresolved trauma, some what you would call the shadow material. So let's talk about that for a moment, because I don't believe we can get to light without going through the shadow. And I know you have written a lot and spoken a lot on that too. So what do we mean by the shadow, and how does that fit into our conversation here?
Yeah, so it's the shadow, in a simple way, is the parts of ourselves that we've buried, that we hide from the world, and sometimes even hide from ourselves. It's those core false beliefs, but it's way more than just the narrative that we hear a lot about. It's really the vibration or the frequency that we're carrying. So let me say it in a really simple way. When I came into the world, I remember being a very young child and being absolutely filled with joy and love and light, and just felt so connected. And then through a series of events called living on planet Earth, I shut down. I buried things. I put things so deep in the shadow or in the unconscious, and wasn't even aware they were running the show. I just kept saying things like, why do I keep choosing these same relationships? Well, that was even the evolved, that was when I was a little further along the path. First, it was like, why do these people keep finding me?
Right.
Right? Why do these jobs keep happening? Why do I continue to have the same issues
Why do
around me?
bad things keep happening to me? The victim consciousness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's actually an invitation to say, I wonder what's in the unconscious. The shadow is just those parts of ourselves we'd rather not show the world or ourselves. So the deeper work is actually integrating that shadow instead of rejecting it.
Yes. Well, and I'd like to point out too. So most people, have that understanding of the shadow as sort of the negative stuff, right? Your negative beliefs, your inner critic, maybe some traumatic experiences or unresolved, stuff. But Jung, who came up with this idea, Carl Jung, great psychologist of the 19th century, or 20th century, 1900s, he talked about also the golden shadow. And I think this is such an interesting concept because you don't hear a lot of talk about it. But the golden shadow is where we also put the positive qualities. So, in order to, for example, believe, to come to believe that I am broken, damaged, unlovable, not enough, you have to kind of hide or kill, something within yourself that is the opposite of that. That is love, that is light, that is beautiful, that is perfect. You have to also relegate that into a shadow.
That's right. That's, our friend Marianne Williamson says, and I, so often quoted, and I love it, is it's not our inadequacies that most frightens us. It's that we're powerful beyond measure. Right. And so what you're talking about is really the suppression of that innate knowing that we're really powerful. That happens in school systems, that happens, in religions, that happens with parents, unconscious tall people, right? Adults that, whether they're teaching us through actually saying and being verbal, or most often it's an energy, right? I remember just being in the energy field of my family system and just closing down and just starting to like diminish or be afraid to show the infinite potential. And that has taken me years to say, wow, actually when I tap into that, not only do I have a life that's filled with more love and connection, but it starts to affect the world in a really positive way. So like the most egotistical thing we can do is to pretend that we're less than, or to pretend that we're not infinite.
Well, and I mean, I think this is bringing us to another point, which is people are afraid to speak up. People are afraid to speak what's true for them. And I think, we've got this cancel culture now where, even we have to be conscious sometimes. I get nervous. I mean, I guess I picked a pretty provocative title for my book. What if you're not as effed up as you think you are? And I got a lot of pushback on that, from various people. How dare you call your book something like that? Or how, nobody's going to take your book seriously. Professionals would tell me, my peers, well, nobody's going to take you seriously with a book title like that. And I just think it's so interesting how much, yes, we've been conditioned to hide, maybe as little kids. I certainly got the message, you're too much, tone it down, how do people navigate that? Because I feel that we're in this time where you're right, like the shadow material, both the golden and the darker shadow, all of it needs to come up and out if we are to move forward and evolve as humanity on this planet. But how do you deal, like, back to the one-on-one, the individual, when someone is afraid to speak up and is afraid to speak their truth? Because let's face it, I mean, you growing up as a young gay boy in a time and in a place that was not receptive to that, and look at how many places in the country or the world are still like that, where your basic identity, your who you identify as a person, the gender, your sexual orientation, whatever it is, like even the color of your skin, your race, like all those things, you potentially could have harm come your way should you dare be open about that, or be, proud of that.
Yeah, and there are so many layers to this conversation. And I want to start by saying the deeper work here for me is the healing of my own trauma, disconnection, and shame. In my book, Conscious Recovery, I identify those as the three root causes of addiction: unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. And it's really important when we're having this conversation to identify and recognize that it's both and, not either or. So yes, it's true. There are places in the world where people are still killed for being gay. Yes, there are places where women aren't allowed to have the power that we know that obviously the planet is very much in need of right now, right? This feminine energy to come into the world. And if we only externalize, then we end up in conflict, right? We want the world to change so that we can be okay. And that work is important. But here's the key, and this is a very nuanced conversation. So if I'm only externalizing it, I have more frustration. It does have a place. We also call that activism. A lot of activism lives there. It is important. I want to be clear. The deeper work is doing my own healing so that I can bring a different energy in a conversation. So, for example, in the LGBTQAI plus community, I see a lot of wounding, and I see a lot of the wounding externalized and making an enemy outside of ourselves and focusing so much on that Totally understandable, totally understandable, right? I lived through the AIDS crisis. I lived through, like, the political climate of the time, all of that happened. But if I don't do my deeper healing, I'm in the fight. And if I'm in the fight, it just creates more. So it's a nuanced conversation, because I think the party line is these people are wrong and bad, and we need to fight for our rights. But that drum has been the drum beat for decades and decades and hundreds of years, and it's time for a new awareness. So once I do more of my own healing, I realize that, like, oh my gosh, there's a different way of perceiving this. And the greatest paradox is then it starts to actually make a difference in the world.
Yes, because more fighting is just perpetrating the polarity. It's almost as if, like, if you truly do, and it's been my experience as well, because, I grew up with a rageaholic father and a lot of fighting and conflict in my home. My parents were children in World War II. They went through a country that was taken over by communism. They had to escape from that. I mean, they had that. It's the intergenerational, trauma of fight. And so I grew up a fighter, and I'm still working my way through that, and how much I'm recognizing that actually when I end the fight within, between my opposing parts, or when I heal the trauma that maybe was done to me or my ancestors or other lifetimes or wherever, how big we want to go with it. When I heal that trauma, then I don't have to externalize my abuser outside of me. And I think you're right. What a lot of people are doing right now is they're taking that victimization and identifying, I am the victim, you, whoever you are, is the enemy, you're my abuser, and I have to now fight. Part of my healing means I have to get stronger and fight back. Whereas actually, I think the energy, the higher vibration of love and healing and kindness and compassion, if we are able to attain some of that energy within by doing the healing work, it's almost like it melts away that energy of abuse and victimization and trauma, if that makes sense. And I think that's how we heal the planet, not by trying to make someone else change, someone you've identified as the enemy, not trying to get them to stop or change. Yes, that may need to happen, but how we're going about it isn't working. We're just doing more of the same.
Well, and that's the key, right? The litmus test is, how is it working? Well, how is it working throughout history is more division, more war, more fighting, more struggle. And it's very tricky, because some people will, I'm going to guess that someone is watching right now and they might hear that we're blaming the victim for this, or that we're saying this isn't happening. We're actually saying something that is outside of the box. And outside of the box, once we step out of that, we empower ourselves. We're actually saying we can empower ourselves. I've worked with clients. I know you've worked with clients. I can think of many clients who, for example, had sexual trauma. It is obviously a very real traumatic event that happened. But because of that, they're thinking, if that person could just apologize, I could be free. But that really doesn't actually heal it. Yes, it would be wonderful. I've worked with people, and I'm sure you have, that can't let go of something and the person's not even alive. And what the empowerment is to say, oh my gosh, this happened. Yes, it was a horrific event, but it's less about what happened and more what I decided about myself. And we can actually change that regardless of what the other person does. And what you said is the key. How's it working? If we start, as we start to shift this, we start to realize that our being more loving, more kind, more open, more curious, that actually starts to heal this division more than fighting. I don't think you can actually fight and have it work out in a way. It's temporary. And then, the pendulum keeps swinging.
And people have fought. Women fought for the right to vote and for equal rights, and people of different, minorities and different religious, everyone has fought for their rights, and here we are, we're still fighting, right? So I agree. I think the key is the empowerment. As long as you're still seeing the enemy, the other, as having more power than you, they are doing this to us, they are making us fill in the blank. As long as the perception is still oriented outward, then they still have the power over us. They're up here on a pedestal and we're down here being lesser than. I think the way to do this is to really take ownership of, okay, yes, these things happened, and now it's my responsibility to take the power back. I am going to heal myself. We have so many different healing modalities out there in the world now that really are accessible to anyone. I mean, I think in this day and age, as long as you have an internet connection, honestly, even if you can't afford to go to rehab or a treatment program or pay for therapy or coaching or whatever it is, there's so much free information out there. Look at this. This is a free conversation we're having, right? Videos and talks and podcasts. You can heal yourself from all kinds of things, but you have to be willing to do it yourself. No one else is going to do it for you.
Yeah. And, to go back, I think, if you think about like women fighting for the right to vote, the gay rights movement, all of those things, it all has a place. So we're not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what we're saying is, are we ready to evolve? So there's a particular political person who has a very large personality. And I see people just so against this person, and this person just keeps rising to power. The more people are against this person, if we were all to just stop that and say, what are we going to stand for instead of what we're going to stand against? How can we bring more love into the world? That's where it actually makes a difference. And when I think about the classic, I did a talk several years ago called Spiritual Activism. The idea of activism in some ways is like, oh, these poor people need me to help them or save them. That keeps that imbalance going. But if I say I'm an equal, I'm one, and I see a need in the world, and I'm going to come stand for something, not against something, that's where we start to see some really profound changes. Like Mother Teresa said, I will not be in an anti-war demonstration, but you have a peace march, I'm in. Now that may sound like semantics, but it is really not.
It's not. It's be the change you want to see in the world. I mean, it's what many revolutionaries saw. And look, Martin Luther King, when he said the way to change is not through violence, the way to change is through nonviolence, right? Like that's what I think we're being called to as the human race, is to be the energy more of the love, the compassion, the non-judgment, the non-resistance. Some of these beautiful spiritual principles, forgiveness, right? Gratitude, these spiritual principles you talk about in your writings. Like if we were to embrace these first and foremost for ourselves, because we're our own worst critics, if we can heal that within and then start to emanate more of that out into the world, there is a 100th monkey phenomenon where if enough people are choosing that, the unconsciousness will lose its power. The forces of evil, if you will start to fall away. And that newer energy will become what's predominant on planet Earth. And I know it feels like we're right on the cusp of, disaster, and like, is that really going to happen? And I was questioning it myself for many years, but I actually feel that we're now in a time where that can happen. It's just real ugly in this moment till we get there.
Yeah, and you said something so important, and I want to really pause and take a moment with it, because when we say something like these leaders came and said the key is nonviolence, we might think that means I'm not going to throw a chair through a window, I'm not going to shoot someone, but there are many forms of violence. The most violent thing I can have is a judgment. Because the judgment is, there's something wrong with you, there's something wrong with me, right? It has an intense energy. So a lot of times I know people who are saying, I'm very spiritual, I'm very loving, love is the answer, but I see their social media posts, they are not being loving. They are like, this person is evil and we must kill them. I mean, almost, right? We must eradicate. You talked about like this idea of eradicating the evil, but through the dualistic lens, it's like, we're the good people, you're the evil people, we must eradicate you. But if we look at it through consciousness, because it's really convenient to say, oh yes, we're all one. But if that's true, then I must be all at one meant with the people who I consider to be different than me, right? We're not talking about I agree to disagree or let's meet in the middle. We're talking about honoring each other. And if there's evil to be eradicated, the evil is the duality. The evil is the judgment, right? So to all of my people who say, I want to bring more peace onto the planet, but I'm going to post these really derogatory stories about this human being, then what am I contributing to? And of course, the impulse is there. Of course, we've been so conditioned to judge that we can justify our point of view. But here's the simple truth. If I believe I'm broken, I see the world as broken. If I know I am whole and complete and loving, I see the world in that way. It doesn't mean there aren't things in the world that I want to be a part of helping to change, but it goes back to, is the judgment really helping? I mean, the answer is too obvious to even name.
Well, it always reminds me of my favorite Rumi quote, out beyond all ideas of right doing and wrongdoing, there is a field. I'll meet you there.
Yeah.
So let's shift gears here a little bit. So if people want to heal within,
Yeah.
right? Where does someone even start?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a lot of different ways a person can start. But for me, it starts with a recognition that this is what's happening internally, not that this is happening externally. It is happening externally. That's obvious, right? But we can say the world is a kind and loving place, and we can find evidence to support it. We can say the world is brutal and hostile, and we can find evidence to support that. So, to the best of our ability, unplug from the world. It's rare that I quote Jesus, but what Jesus had probably the most profound statement I've heard, and that is be in the world, but not of it. Right. So to be in the world and not of it. And, we don't know if Jesus said that, but it is said that Jesus said it. I love, there's a meme that I see on social that says, I'm pretty sure I never said that, the Buddha. Right. But we have been taught that Jesus said to be in the world and not of it. So what does that mean? That means that I can stay centered in the truth of my being, regardless of what's happening. So the first step for me is always finding safe places externally so that we can start to work on the safe places internally. So whether that's, a community, not of like-minded people, but of people who are dedicated to knowing the truth. And I don't mean the truth of like, I'm right and you're wrong, but a deeper reality. I think it's finding, therapists, counselors, and coaches that can help you. But it's also just, a wise person said there are 3 steps to begin this process: awareness, awareness, and awareness. And I think the greatest freedom we can have is freedom from the reactive impulse. So now it's mostly, this is the reactive impulse online, right? We have our phones in our hands like, how dare you? So to be aware of that and to, because a lot of times when we talk about anger, it's like count to 10. But what do we do during those 10 seconds? Check in and actually feel.
Yeah, I agree. I think starting with awareness, recognizing, being honest with yourself, being willing to be honest with yourself, being willing to be vulnerable with yourself, and really look within, where without going into a self judgment, self blame place. Like, how have I contributed to the state of affairs in my life? What choices have I made that have gotten me to this place? What other choices could I make? I also really like, I think, what the process you've outlined, the movie technique that you've outlined in your most recent book, Conscious Creation, and we did a cool workbook for that. I mean, can you just give people a brief overview? This is another possible way to start looking at creating your life in a more conscious way, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's like we can pick up a book and the information so resonates with our soul that it's life-changing. Right. And so Conscious Creation was born out of my own personal experience of going into that dark night of the soul and really asking myself, am I going to consciously create my life now, or am I going to go back to the unconscious patterning that I have had for the 40 years that preceded it? And so Conscious Creation really was born at that time out of a knowing that most of us are creating our lives unconsciously. It's the unconscious beliefs, ideas, patterns, and frequency that we're carrying that create what we call reality. So the 5-step process that I developed over the years since that time that ultimately led to Conscious Creation being published in 2021, I gave it an acronym of MOVIE because the premise is we're creating the movie of our life, right? We're the director, we're the actors, we're everything in this movie. And we're holding the projector. And if we have a piece of lint on the lens, we see it everywhere in the world. And we think that the problem is outside and it must be healed outside. So the 5-step process MOVIE is making peace with the past, overcoming core false beliefs, visioning, intention setting, and embodying the vision. Most people think they're going to create their life by setting goals and using action-based techniques to change their reality. And of course, that can change it to a certain extent. It's kind of like the thing with politics, right? That changes it to a certain extent. But if I haven't made peace with the past and healed a lot of my past and overcome the core ideas I have about myself and the world, no amount of intention setting or action is going to actually change anything. So those first two steps are what I call the clearing steps, so that we can tap back into our essential self and start creating our lives from that place instead of from the programs of our mind.
And so then, yes, I agree. You cannot create fully if you have not cleared first. And that's a lot of my work too. And I might do that with different energy-based modalities that really are effective at shifting that energy. And then what? And then visioning, intention, say more about those latter stages.
Yeah. So visioning, that whole step is dedicated to my friend Michael Beckwith. He wrote the book Life Visioning, and a lot of us have been trained, especially sort of in the spiritual circles of the last 20 or 30 years. It's like the vision boards, hold the picture of what you want to create and like stay really clear that that's what you want, and then you will attract it. Visioning is completely different. Once we've made peace with the past, and that's a process, but as long as we've done enough of it, overcome these core false beliefs that have been running the show, we can then tap into a visioning process, which is really different than visualization. Visioning is saying, I don't know, but I know deep within me, my intuitive self, my spiritual self, my essential being has answers and direction for my life that I can't even fathom in my mind. So the intention of visioning is to be as clear as possible. And I actually use Michael Beckwith's visioning process. I spell it out in my book, and he wrote the foreword to the book, which I'm so grateful for. And I always want to honor him because he really created this system of listening quietly so that we can be directed from that place of inner vision.
Yeah, wonderful. So as we wind down our conversation, it's been such a rich conversation. Um, what do we want to leave our listeners and viewers with? I mean, I think we've named the truth of what's happening in our times. I'd like to think we gave people hope and maybe an inspiration for a path forward. But what are your thoughts, your final thoughts on this?
You know, it's interesting. I do a lot of media and I love this question. And I find myself saying almost the same thing every time because sometimes the simplest truth can be really powerful. And what I want to impart to anyone who's watching or listening right now, in that is something really simple. You are a whole and perfect being. You came into the world as an infinite being, a spark of divinity. That's still the truth of who and what you are. My invitation is to take a look at any ideas that you've had, any experiences that you've had that have caused you to believe something about yourself other than that. To the best of your ability, unplug from what's happening in the world, plug into this deeper source energy that you are, and start to question every idea and every belief you've ever had. Reconnect with that greater reality. And then from that place, ask yourself, what can I now bring into my life and then into the world from this place of wholeness? And how might that start to change what I call reality?
Brilliant. Couldn't have said it better myself. Ditto everything TJ said.
Thank you.
Oh, what a wonderful conversation. I am so grateful for your friendship, for your contribution to our conversation today. Thank you also, everyone who listened today. TJ, if people want to find out more about you, about your books, your courses, I mean, there's so many things you've created out there. Where can they go?
tjwoodward.com. Very simple. And I just want to say congratulations to you, Adriana, for the 100th episode, but also the 99 that preceded this, having these conversations that really matter. Being, both of us being in the mental health field, what else is possible? As I know, a question you love to live in. And I love the title of your podcast because it invites us to look at what is this kaleidoscope of different possibilities for our life and for our world right now. So thank you for saying yes to that calling. I know it's a serious commitment.
Can't wait to see where we're at 5-10 years from now.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for tuning in today. If you have liked this podcast, please do help us get it out there in the world. Share it with people. rate it, review it. We're trying to get more reviews on Apple and all the other platforms, YouTube, subscribe, follow us, all the things, because that will help this information get out there to those who are searching, who really might be in a dark place right now. We want to offer this ray of hope. We want to be that support for you if that is helpful. So I really thank you all for supporting the work, and see you next time.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Kaleidoscope of Possibilities, Alternative Perspectives on Mental Health. This has been Dr. Adriana Popescu. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share with others. To find out more about me, my guests, and more, please visit my website at adrianapopescu.org. See you next time.